We're scheduled to start at 10:45, and we're a bit past that already, so we're going to begin the process to enable this panel of extremely bright people to share some thoughts. My name is John Wong. I am the founding chairman of ARIA, the Asian Real Estate Association of America, and I'm excited to have with me a panel of individuals that have experienced all components, of this particular issue, navigating the housing challenge for the AANHPI community. But they have specialized in different segments. We have individuals who are focused on counseling and enabling first-time folks. We have folks who have built affordable housing, and we have a researcher, and we have an advocate. So all of us do all of those things in some level, but there's some specialty there. So with me on the stage is Lena Zhu, who's a senior research associate with the Housing Finance Policy Center of the Urban Institute. Haipin Im is the president and CEO of FACE, the Faith and Community Empowerment Group. Angie Liu is the executive director of Asian Community Development Corporation. And Brian Green is the vice president of policy advocacy for the National Association of Realtors. So to kind of frame this conversation, the title of this discussion is called Navigating the AANHPI Housing Challenge, Bridging Gaps and Creating Solutions. So when you talk about this particular subject, many of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. On that very base level is shelter. And when we're talking about shelter, a place to get out of the rain and cold, so a conversation about this issue really is about shelter. And that can span the spectrum from emergency housing needs, to supported, to assisted, to rental, to ownership components. So the conversation can span that entire bandwidth. A lot of our conversation is going to be talking on the creation, accessibility of either rental, ownership, and perhaps some supported housing. So where do you begin this conversation? With some data, and Lena with the Urban Institute will kindly share some facts about the AANHPI community, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, and some of the nuances of this particular segment. So Lena.
Thank you, John, and thanks so much for having me today. As the researcher on the stage, I feel like it's my responsibility to feed you with some data points. Over the past several decades, we've seen a significant increase in the AANHPI, I will just call it Asian in this presentation, population growth, and it's expected to grow to account for over 9% by 2060. But despite this significant growth in population, this community is often neglected in data, underrepresented in research, or ignored in policy decision makings. And one of the areas that has been under-discussed is the housing market, which is the focus of our discussion today. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to go through some of the data points we had at Urban Institute to highlight some of the disparity and challenges Asian Americans face in the housing market. So are you ready for a data buffet before your lunch? Let's dive right in. So a majority share of Asian population in the country have stayed here for many years, obtained citizenship, and bought homes. So over the past 40 years, as you can see here in this figure, Asian homeownership rate has increased significantly. They have experienced the greatest increase in homeownership, from 52% in 1980 to 60% in 2019. We see a positive correlation between the length of stay in the US and the homeownership rate. In other words, the longer you stay, the higher the homeownership rate. So here you see that in 2019, for those immigrants who have been in the US for more than 20 years, their homeownership rate is 74% as compared to the 44% for those who have stayed here between 6 to 10 years. And the rate is only as low as 19% for those stay here for less than 5 years. And so oftentimes, the AAPI community or the Asian households are framed as the hardworking model minorities who, at the aggregate level, financially better off compared to other people of color. However, what's missing in this big picture is that this population has long faced historical challenges and structural barriers to access home ownership. Household income is one key factor contributing to obtaining homeownership. However, here you can see that even if we control for the household income, we see Asian households have a substantially lower homeownership rate compared to their majority white counterparts and closer to the rate for Black and Hispanics. For those households earning between 100,000 and 150,000, the homeownership rate for Asian is around 66% as compared to 83% for whites, 67% for Black, and 67% for Hispanics. And this gap, or this pattern, holds across all income buckets. Another factor affecting homeownership is the educational attainment. Here, we also break down the homeownership at their educational level, and even doing so, we still see the gap is pretty pronounced there. For those with a bachelor degree, 63% of Asians are homeowners as compared to 77 or 76% for whites. So there is a pronounced over 10 percentage points difference or gap there. And also this gap holds across all three different educational attainment level. One of the reasons that could possibly explaining the gap here is the language barrier and limited English proficiency. So Asians who do not speak English well are observed to have lower homeownership rate than those who speak fluent English. As you can see, the last two data points here, in 2019, there's roughly 11 percentage point difference between the two groups. So the language barrier do play a key role here. So far, we've viewed this AAPI community as a whole, but what about the disparities within the community with respect to different experiences for people coming from different countries? So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to highlight some disparities within this community, focusing on the top 6 ethnic group based on their country of origin with the largest population in the US. So here, the 6 groups we focus here include Asian Indians, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese. And we also here you can see on the graph we have 2 separate groups, the native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, as well as other Asian ethnic groups. So the 2 separate groups here, we did that because of the limitation of data, the really thin sample size for these 2 groups. But we do acknowledge that by lumping some of the population into such categories called other may erase the nuances within those communities. So we do acknowledge the need for more disaggregated data and more conversations to look at those underserved, underrepresented communities. So here you can see that over the past 4 years, AAPI population increased significantly for most groups, but the growth rate varies. In 2019, to sum up, the top 6 groups account for roughly 82% of the total AAPI population. Similarly here, even though we just saw a significant increase in homeownership rate overall for the AAPI community, but the rate actually varies across different groups. Particularly for the Vietnamese group, you can see that their homeownership raised from 27.2% in 1980s and sharply to 67% in 2019. And if we look at the correlation between income and home ownership, we basically see that those two are largely correlated, with the exception for the 2 yellow dots here, Vietnamese and Asian Indians. So for Asian Indians, even though they statistically have the highest income, but their home ownership rate is relatively lower, actually lower than the overall average in this community. This could partially reflect the limited length or tenure they stay in the US, because a fewer share of them obtain citizenship over the past few years. But we do see that for the other yellow dots here, they tend to have they, like they have the highest home ownership, but their income is not the highest. So why is that? One reason to explain this pattern or deviation is that they tend to have they tend to live in the U.S. for longer. So a lot of them moved to the U.S. after the Vietnam War, which ended in 1975. So different from other groups, many of them who may choose to return to their origin country after years. Vietnamese, they tend to stay, they have the greater intention to stay permanently and have greater incentive to become homeowners, so that we can see that they have right now the highest home ownership rate. So now, by disaggregating the data, we observe these disparities within the community, which highlight the need for more disaggregated data. And I hope that these data points can help us lay the foundation for some of the discussion we will have today.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and thank you, Nina. The data here, let's kind of frame this out. So we're going to talk about some of the hurdles in a very specific manner. But really the overall framing of this is that there are resources to help all underserved communities achieve homeownership. There is a goal in the government, and there's a goal in private industry, the banks. But the reality in some of our discussions that the amount of funds allocated toward the AANHPI segment pales in comparison to other groups. There's no denying all the groups deserve and need service. But what is the reason we're going to discuss why banks, why the federal government is not allocating the funds needed? And part of it might be that, home ownership's at 60%. You look at the census, higher median income, higher education, they don't need help. So we're going to touch this. There's a term called model minority myth that we hear kind of bantered about. And from each of you, maybe starting with, what is the model minority myth? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? And I'll say that if somebody tells me, you're smart, you're wealthy, it's hard for me to say, no, I'm not. But the reality, not saying that creates some challenges. So would you, please, anyone share your comments?
Start. When someone says you're doing great, as John mentioned, you don't want to minimize that. However, the reality is very different many times. And for the Asian American community, there is actually 50 groups and 100 languages. So they're throwing everyone and the kitchen sink under that umbrella when we don't share language, culture, history, etc. And so if you'll see here on the PowerPoint, if you disaggregate that 50 group, and this only highlights so many, you'll see a very different reality. As a Korean American, Korean and Black homeownership rate is the same. But there's actually, There's actually 7 other API subgroups below the Korean and Black homeownership rate, and 12 other API subgroups below the Hispanic homeownership rate. And this is covering kind of key areas where there's a large, sizable Asian American presence. And so that tells a very different reality. And so for us, as Asian Americans, what we see is that we lose out on solidarity with other communities of color because of the model minority myth that we are doing well when we're not. And we could show up not just as allies, but really, again, this impacts our community. This is something that impacts all of us, and to be on the same team. And then the second piece is that we also lose out on investments, resources, opportunities, outreach, education. And what we see, and again, the data that, that was shown shows only a portion. What we see consistently is the fact that when Asian Americans get in trouble, they have the hardest time coming back because, again, lack of resources, opportunities, et cetera, as well.
So what I'm hearing from your perspective is that the model minority renders those who are in need and could access existing programs, but they're invisible to the folks. So there's always been a question, is it insidious? Are they trying to withhold stuff from us? Or really, there's just not lack of awareness. And let me talk on the housing supply side from you. So resources are available to help build. Mm-hmm. I sense that you focus on building affordable properties that serve the AANHPI community. Any challenges based on the minority myth?
Well, I think Angie could speak, but just real quickly, what I see is this new awareness that minority, builders, developers are lacking in the country. And so I see a thrust, like Freddie Mac has invested in 2 areas to be able to invest in helping minority developers get into access funding, contracts, et cetera. But again, the outreach to the Asian community is like the areas that they select, again, remove or exclude as a priority of API-centered community.
Sure.
So that's just, I'm just giving some examples.
Well,
of
I'm curious
where-
from Angie, because you live in that space. You have to get resourced to do what you do. Are there any challenges, questions? Is there even a need to build affordable or subsidized?
Sure. So I serve as the executive director of the Asian Community Development Corporation. We are a nonprofit CDC based in Boston's Chinatown, and we have been doing holistic community development for close to 40 years. So a big part of our work is really building and preserving affordable housing, but also helping folks in our community to access homeownership when they are ready to do so. And before I come back to the supply question and challenges, I do want to pick up a little bit more on the model minority.
Sure.
You know, and John, completely agree when you said that when data is not disaggregated for our community, when there is a single Asian label in data, we've seen this over and over again, especially during the last few years during pandemic, saw data about unemployment, effect on small businesses, vaccine rates, you name it. Most of the data out there either did not have enough data for Asians, or when it was presented, it was a single label, and that flattens the disparities among our communities. Remember, as Hypen said, our communities are extremely diverse. We have really highly educated professionals who came here on professional visas as a result of immigration policy. We also have communities, for example, from Southeast Asian countries who came here as refugees, right? So very, very different socioeconomic backgrounds that contribute to the disparities. And the model minority myth is one that is really insidious because then policymakers tend to point to us and say, look, they're doing well, they pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, why can't the Black and the Latinx communities do so, right? And that's actually a very insidious way of using that myth to prop us up as a wedge against other communities of color. Many of our AANHPI ethnic communities, and historically that's how we have survived, right? By concentrating in like little, like Chinatowns, little Tokyos, Filipino towns. And historically, these communities are in high-cost areas. And so that supply problem has been exacerbated because many of these ethnic communities, we have lost a lot of land due to gentrification and displacement. So that has been a very challenging issue for us in trying to not only create new housing supply, but to even preserve what we have.
And I just want to add one more piece is that these ethnic enclaves initially came to be because they were also limited, right? Until the Fair Housing Law came into effect, Asians, just as Latinos, Blacks, and other communities of color were excluded from being able to move into, I guess, more affluent neighborhoods as well. And so, again, wealth building has also been limited in the API community.
Yeah, I don't want to touch on something, a question for you, and I know you have a comment, but there's a piece of this, is what we've noted from our research is that during COVID, and especially of work from home, the diaspora, the concentration of the Asian segment just on the coast, which historically had been, you know, LA, San Francisco, New York, has actually increased. Some of the states with the largest growth in the Asian segment were like Idaho, you know, very close to the tech workers in Oregon, an hour flight away. So in your research, any shifts in the changes of where folks are located, and how might that impact the data?
That could probably be our research agenda for 2024.
Okay.
Thank you, John. So we did use data to look at the concentration of Asian households prior to the pandemic. But I think I totally agree that this trend of working from home or the shifting of the tech industry may have an impact on the relocation pattern of this community. So we will definitely look into that. And one thing I would like to add on the model minority myth, from a researcher's perspective, I think one negative impact of that myth is often in research reports whenever they have an equity angle, you will see in the figure several groups: white, black, Hispanic, other. So Asian is always grouped into the other. I think that's something that needs to be changed moving forward. We need improvements in data. As other panelists mentioned, we need more disaggregated data. But also, what I think, on top of the data, we need more intention to look at the nuances within this community. For example, 2 years ago, when we first released our blog highlighting the lower homeownership rate by income, by education, also the higher mortgage denial rates, everyone was so surprised to see the results and someone even challenged the validity of our result. Oh, is that really the case? That is the case after validation and robustness checks. So that is the true reality. And I think those questions reflect people's intention, like they tend to think we're really doing well. So from the researcher's perspective, I think that kind of stereotype could sometimes be a barrier in what type of direction we go in the research. Do we look at the disparity within the community? Do we just try to lump all this remaining population into the other groups? So all those decisions could reflect our thoughts here.
Many of us focus on this segment. I want to turn to Brian, because your policy, which involves all of this, but for a broad cross-section of Americans, because your organization has 1,500,000 reps and they represent a whole bunch of people. So what are your thoughts on this concept of just having a stereotypic opinion of any group?
Well, first it's wrong.
Yeah.
So we at the National Association of Realtors put out a report every year called the Snapshot of Home Buying by Race. And so in the 2023 report, there's a lot of interesting data. We don't disaggregate, and I think that's a direction we ought to move in. This is a report that looks at racial groups across the board, and I think there may be some value sometimes at looking at this aggregate Asian number, but when I was at HUD, worked with you, John, and Aria and others to emphasize the importance of disaggregation. So I think that is ultimately the ideal. But speaking to the question of the model minority, I mean, obviously, theoretically, well, it's a double-edged sword. Theoretically, that could have some benefit. You could actually, get favorable treatment, theoretically. But it also means when you face discrimination, that people ignore your claims because they have this perception. When we look at this snapshot, we see in the people we surveyed in 2022, Asian Americans said that they witnessed discrimination only 1% of the time, and they said that they encountered steering only 1% of the time. That's hard to imagine. At the same time, in that same survey, Asian Americans were more likely than whites and Hispanics to report that they see appraisal discrimination. And this is something that ARIA is focused on. So next to African Americans, Asian Americans were the one group to say that this is a big problem that they have witnessed. So I think it's very interesting to sort of unpack that. But getting back to the even reporting of discrimination, I know, from my experience at HUD that the surveys we conducted suggest also there was a reluctance both to recognize and to report discrimination. So I think there's, some possibility that people who are facing discrimination don't see it or don't recognize it because it's not explicit. And a lot of studies that we've done suggest that unless you see how others are treated,
Yes.
you may be facing discrimination and be unaware. And so there's a lot of testing that's shown that. Long Island Newsday up in New York, they did a study where they showed that a lot of the discrimination that's occurring, people aren't aware of.
Yeah.
So, and then beyond this, the disaggregation is really important because these aggregate numbers mask what may be happening. And as we see here, that there are certain Asian subgroups that are facing.
So what I'm
same
hearing
low
from
rates.
all your comments is that with more granular data, we get a deeper understanding of what the real issues are, which may in fact not be uniform across the board, but there are certain parts of it that need more assistance and certain parts that need less. So really the solution is to really get in there and start identifying the different subgroups within this broader AANHPI, and with that data we might have some. There's one other subject that I think limited English proficiency is the formal term that the GSEs and stuff, kind of use in the banks. But language issues are. I mean, there's always the the story that has some validity, that you have a 10-year-old child translating financial documents and purchase contract documents for parents who have very limited English ability. So what is your experience around that, and what are some of the ways that you're helping folks who are not as comfortable in English understand this entire process, whether it's financing, whether it's the real estate transaction itself? Maybe we start with you, Brian, from the realtors. How are you addressing this issue, and is there support, for individuals who are working with consumers who are comfortable in a language other than English?
Yeah, well, we've always been advocates for translation of documents. In fact, there are some of our state associations who've been real leaders in that, and we're going to hold up in April when we celebrate Fair Housing Month what they've been doing in Massachusetts around this. So I think the other aspect of this is it's important that we have a range of real estate professionals of different backgrounds to help consumers who can speak the language of consumers. And specifically with the AANHPI community, that survey that I mentioned, we find that that population, more than any other, states that they rely on the services of a real estate agent. And I would love to dig into that, but I have a suspicion that some of that has to do with language affinity.
I think that ARIA, one of its efforts was in fact to have on the loan application form a little checkbox if there's a language other than English you prefer. And the dynamics of advocacy, we have strong relationship with a lot of the lenders. Mortgage Bankers Association was dead set against this because of concern that if somebody checks the box that we don't have the service capability, are we putting ourselves at risk? So it's always a back and forth dynamic to find a happy medium. But I think we're moving toward that. And frankly, with technical abilities of digital translations and stuff, we'll see where that goes. But I know, you prior to FACE, when we first met, probably 20 years ago with the Korean spiritual, you did a lot of work with home buying counseling, and then later on with, during the foreclosure crisis, with outreach. So what is your experience with folks and the needs of limited English proficient individuals?
Our organization's name was Korean Churches for Community Development. We actually got our model from an African American church. But since then, we have shifted into a broader name of Faith and Community Empowerment. But going back, it's not just realtors, it's really the number of housing counseling agencies. And during the foreclosure crisis, there were only 5 Asian agencies in the whole country that got the National Foreclosure Mitigation Counseling money. And it was a sub-grantee amount, so it was like pathetically nothing. And so you could imagine trying to have 5 agencies address millions of homeowners around these 50 groups, 100 languages. It doesn't exist. When Freddie Mac launched their Credit Smart Asian, they convened 10 API organizations. This was about maybe like 10 years ago. And you know what? Only 2, ours and AANHPI, were the only 2 HUD-approved counseling agency. The 3rd one just got on, and 7 others were just barely getting into financial literacy. And so again, that whole model minority myth and investments, the lack of housing counseling agencies in the country that will do the outreach in the various languages. In LA, we could help someone with over $200,000 in down payment assistance. So we were a partner. Again, we're not a big operation, but Freddie Mac reached out to us to provide the translation review of their curriculum. FDIC and their Money Smart, we were their partner to, again, review the translation. So there's just a very limited number of housing counseling agencies in this country, in the community development space, again, because of lack of investments. During COVID, City of LA, there were a lot of resources that were being shared. And again, Asian is the 2nd largest minority population in the City of LA, County of Los Angeles. None of it, none of the outreach, none of the materials were in language. And so you saw here, this data, Federal Reserve 2022 report, looking at financial conditions of businesses. You didn't even have to disaggregate API data. Asians had the worst financial condition. And that comes from coming out of the COVID, where they faced the double virus, right?
Yeah.
Corona and the hate virus.
And the
So I
Asian
could
hate.
kind of go on, and even around, discrimination. When you don't have the language capacity, you can't fight for yourself. You don't know the laws. You don't know your rights, especially, again, when there aren't agencies to handhold you through the process because of the lack of investments.
Yeah, and I'll share a personal impression of the results from this, because we're discussing broadly. So during the foreclosure crisis, I was involved in listing REO properties. It was an interesting experience with other REO members and individuals who in the space outside. It was not uncommon that when you did the site access for a property that was foreclosed on, it was trashed. People were angry, things were torn up, it was destroyed. Oftentimes, when you went to a property to do the first site visit, and there was an Asian surname, it was broom clean. It was spotless. And then when you reach back, we reached back to Wells Fargo and the other, and there was never any attempt by the owners to reach the banks to see what help. There were loss mitigation procedures all across the board, but these individuals, whether it's English proficiency or just lack of outreach, had no clue they were there. So when they left, they cleaned everything up, swept the room up, and you know, when we took over as the listing agent, there was very little to do. And that was, I think, a result of lack of understanding, lack of outreach, and perhaps the language challenges. So Lena, any thoughts on language not having that capability in your research?
Yes, in our research, so when we look at the denial rate, we see one of the big denial reason for this population is incomplete applications. And there's right now no empirical link testing like the causal relationship, or because of this limited English proficiency lead to greater share of incomplete application, but there could be some potential correlation there. So I think with the advancement of technology, there might be some way practically to improve the situation. For example, we can rely on the recent development AI to improve the translation. And also I want to highlight the difference across generations. I think language barrier is maybe relatively speaking, less of an issue for younger generations. For example, generation of my age, maybe a greater share of us immigrants encounter this experience in language. But for our parents, for older generations, they tend not to rely so much on their cell phones or technology or internet. So how to actually help them given their preferences, I think that should be something to focus on moving forward.
So there's a generational component. Angie, so what is your experience around this? I mean, if the operation you have is close to Boston's Chinatown,
Sure.
Is there a need? Do folks come in who can't ask questions in English? And
Vast majority of the clients and residents we serve identify as having limited English proficiency, or some of them might even be monolingual, meaning they do not speak English at all. So hiring bilingual staff who are culturally competent is really important for us, but it's also a challenge because we need someone who not only speaks the language, but they either need to have this professional knowledge or they need to receive substantial training to conduct services like housing counseling, which is actually very hands-on. Translating materials like forms and documents is a great first step, but oftentimes we find that that is not enough. Our agency is actually the only HUD-certified housing counseling agency in all of Massachusetts that provides these services and the classes in Mandarin and Cantonese. As Hypen referenced, we are very diverse as a population, including languages. Think about all the different languages our population speak. There is no single Asian language. Even for Chinese, there are several different dialects that sound very, very different. And so we do our best to try to provide those services in language to make sure that someone can successfully navigate through the whole home buying process. We saw the challenges during the pandemic where we really expanded our services to help residents who were falling behind on rent or mortgage payments to access emergency housing assistance. During the pandemic, Massachusetts' system for accessing those assistance is entirely online. And language access, shockingly, was an afterthought for them. Their initial way of dealing with it was Google Translate, which was horrendous for languages like Chinese and Vietnamese, which just came out as gibberish. It was barely intelligible. And so we had to contract with the state to say we need actual human beings, professional staff, to serve as that bridge to do the outreach and to help people navigate through that process.
what a concept. Real human beings doing the work. Wow, I like this. No, so there are two very special entities up here because they're one of the few. The only one in the state of Massachusetts, one of only three. So part of it is like modelment. You guys must be the absolute best to be the only ones. But the reality is there isn't enough resource. What are anyone's thoughts here? And how can we expand that? What is the solution to have more support in languages in addition to English? Is it just people don't know about it, or are folks who have those language skills not moving into this space? They'll rather work for an AI company that does translation. I'm just curious, your thoughts.
So I think that, first of all, the AI is a potential tool. So
Okay.
I don't want to exclude that.
Okay.
And there are some translation companies that are able to do it, but it's pricey still. And so I hope to see some investments again, whether by funders or policymakers, that will allow for access. So for City of LA, I'm part of a AAPI coalition, and we are going to the city and saying, by law, you're supposed to provide language access. Make sure you put money in the budget to be able to provide that translation resource, right? But I would like to advocate for maybe, just like earlier in the other panel, like let's all pull money for, earthquake, fire, flood, whatever. Could there be a pooling of money so that nonprofits, or maybe even corporate businesses, that we could all access into this language translation opportunity.
Okay.
So
I
wanna
want
put
to
that
go
out
to
there.
Brian, and part of it, you're with NAR right now, fairly senior in the policy side, but you also have a lot of HUD experience. So maybe drawing on the HUD experience with limited English proficiency, was that something that the government is thinking of, and was it doing any work, and where do we stand on that?
Yeah, certainly a top priority when I was at HUD, and that was also being advocated by all of the agencies participating in the White House initiative for Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders. I can't tell you, having been out of HUD now for over 4 years, where the agencies are on that. Definitely there was a major thrust on it and a recognition that we were seeing just higher rate of immigration, higher need for these services. We were seeing then even greater home ownership gaps and the recognition that these services were necessary for closing it. We at the National Association of Realtors continue to advocate for more services along those lines. I know also when I was at HUD, they were doing a lot more in terms of ensuring that their own services at HUD, like when you called the agency for assistance, that everyone in the agency recognized what language assistance was available. So I'm hoping that's continued to move apace. But no doubt we still need that for a range of groups.
Yeah, and I think there's some learning we can watch as the appraisal bias issue is being debated and remedies are sought, which live appraisers don't like automated valuation systems as much. There are some thoughts that you can separate out, the bias by having the right algorithm, but there's the chance that if the programmers inadvertently, because of lack of understanding, plug it in, it can be like redline and exacerbate things.
Absolutely.
So, yes, I'm sorry.
Just a couple comments. I was in some meetings with HUD, and basically something that could encourage more people of different ethnicities, different communities of color to enter into this space. They created that whole certification to elevate the field so that more housing counselors could come into play. But also, again, compensation is a factor. And so HUD also worked on some kind of a fee structure so that, again, banks could also be incentivized to be able to now allow to provide compensation for housing counseling agencies to be providing counseling. So that's that. Just on a side note, around home buying process, Asians, if you see here, this is a little old data, so I want to advocate for, again, disaggregation and more data in the API community, but it's real. I don't think things have changed. I was equally shocked. The API, in terms of the home buying process, had the highest rate in housing discrimination. And what were they discriminated on? Housing availability, inspections, financing assistance, and agent encouragement. So again, we're in the same boat. I'm thinking, I don't know even about appraisal values. No one's done the study on Asians, so I'm not sure. But discrimination is discrimination, and APIs are in the same boat.
And I think the learning from this discussion is it's an evolving situation. Historically, those from this segment were discriminated against. In San Francisco, if you had an Asian surname, when you called to show a property, you would be told that it's not available. No Chinese are welcome here. So there was that overt. And then there was a period of time in recent times where, oh my God, this crazy rich Asians pay all cash and they pay more than ask. And all of a sudden it became a desirable component. And then Asian hate came, and all of a sudden it became, so it's a continuous moving target. Having data and deeper understanding will allow us to actually more effectively handle the issue.
So, John, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So, you started to talk about appraisals again. As I said earlier, ARIA, which you were the founding chairman of, has really highlighted this issue of appraisal discrimination. And I spoke on a panel at ARIA. And I mentioned also that our data shows that this in particular of all the different issues that we've asked people about, Asian Americans, along with African Americans, have highlighted this as a significant problem in the communities. Based on your experience and your work with ARIA, what are people seeing and reporting, and is it particular to the experience in communities that are predominantly Asian, or is it the fact that Asian Americans often live among other people of color and they're seeing those communities face discrimination, or is it discrimination people are seeing as individuals? I'm just wondering if you have any insight into that data and the emphasis that uniquely, I think, Asian Americans are highlighting.
I'll respond, as one of the leaders in ARIA in our conversations with our members. And because ARIA's membership, 18,000, distributed over 45 chapters across the country, there are differences. Where I actually work in San Francisco, the population of individuals of Asian heritage is so large that I think that the appraisal bias against a home that you walk into that is clearly owned by an Asian in communities like that has not been as much of an issue. But for other individuals, for instance, parts of Texas and stuff, I think that there is a differentiation. And I don't know if it's insidious or is it just common stereotypic thought, about what folks are doing. There are other parts of the country where the AANHPI community are workforce housing. I mean, they own restaurants, they own grocery stores. And so there's a perception about homes that this segment live. Where I'm from, near Silicon Valley, you have Asians, he must be a tech person, and so it's nuanced in that there's not one overarching thing. And again, it's looking at the different places and where the real issues are. So let's shift over to supply a little bit, because when we want to address homeownership for this segment, access, understanding of resources, we talked about that, different ways that we can resolve that. But there is an issue regarding supply itself. And I'm going to kind of approach this interesting because Brian and I are on the market side. We deal with folks who just buy homes and stuff, and how do you access? Maybe you have language capabilities, et cetera, and you can go there. But as I mentioned in the opening, housing and shelter runs the gamut. There's not just market rate. There's subsidized, there's supported. In fact, there's emergency housing. I'm curious, what are your thoughts, each one of you, on the right balance of market rate versus subsidized and supported? Affordable, is kind of the word that's tossed around right now. Where do the two fit? And maybe I'll start with you, Hanji, because you're in that space. I suspect that much of what you developed is low to mod, and it's not as opposed to a developer who has inclusionary requirements that I'm going to build market, but I'm forces, but I have the ability to also serve the community by having certain units that are for a low to mod segment. So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, because our organization is a nonprofit, so that mission-driven focus is already a fundamentally different starting point than a market rate developer, right? We're not trying to turn a significant profit. We don't have investors who would put in equity who we need to show a minimum percentage of return. And because our mission is really focused on preserving our community and making sure that the low and moderate income immigrant community can remain in that community. So earlier I referenced to many of the AANHPI ethnic communities being in high-cost areas, and many of them are under threat of shrinking due to gentrification and displacement. In the service area that we work in, Boston's Chinatown, it's over 90% renter occupied. There are very, very, very few homeowners. So in terms of our housing work, a lot of our focus is actually more on the rental side. Historically, we have developed a lot more affordable rentals. And also on the housing finance side, there are a lot more subsidies for rentals. Homeownership, in terms of increasing supply, I think generally across the nation there are just not as many resources. However, because Massachusetts and Greater Boston have become such high-cost areas, that there's been more recent local and state funding for the supply side. One thing that I do want to talk about in terms of supply side, and well, actually two things. So in the past, how we've sort of looked at market rate versus affordable housing. Right. In the case of Boston's Chinatown, this last census, 2020, shows that we've experienced so much gentrification and incoming luxury developments that now the Asian population has fallen under 50% of our census tracts. That's how much it's changed and transformed. So our school of thought is that we cannot stop market rate development. That is unrealistic. It's pushing against a tide. But we've done a couple of projects where we do a mixed income development where we're leveraging the market rate side in order to provide deeper subsidy or to subsidize more affordable housing units than we could have done just doing it all affordable housing.
So it could be in the form of a public-private partnership.
Correct.
It could be new regs to say that if you grew a certain number of affordable, your density can be increased. You can go up a little taller. So those are some
Yes.
of the ideas that are happening. So they would work for the AANHPI community. And I ask this, it's almost loaded, because part of this stereotype model minority, if you're Asian, you want a McMansion. You want something that's 50,000 square feet. And that's that perception of this segment. What I'm hearing is that's also a stereotype that ain't true for the huge part of the segment. So is that accurate for the communities that you serve?
Yeah, I mean, Boston is a very old and dense city, especially where Chinatown is. So over the years, we've run, our share of community engagement and visioning processes. And over again, what we find that is that residents are willing to make the trade-off of living in denser and smaller places, including high-rises, if they know that it's going to create deeper affordability and having more affordable units. They know that they're not going to get like a standalone single-family home, even if it's a small condo. But the benefit that they get is that they get to stay in the communities of their choosing, where even if they don't speak a lot of English, they can access services, schools, and all the other wraparounds in the language that they're familiar with.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that within this segment, an assumption of a style of home, or even now geographic location, those assumptions that might be made are no longer true, and it's only through really looking and understanding where the needs are that you have different things that each part of the segment needs. We're getting toward the end of the time, but we've talked now about access to support to help somebody into shelter. There are also historically in this country some barriers. I think within the African American community, it was clear that after World War II, the way loans were set up and it was said that, and way valuations were set up from lenders and from the government, that if there were individuals of African American living in a neighborhood, it devalued the property. So there was some systemic stuff that caused some problems. So I want to finish this on something that's emerging for not just this segment, for all segments. And again, I'd say this from perspective of being in the industry as a broker for 40 years. The way things work is that you have individuals that guide folks who want to sell property and maybe more importantly, help guide folks who buy property. There are fiduciary responsibilities that that representative has from a legal standpoint, and also sometimes in the realtor's case, a code of ethics piece. And so there's a question, there has been a lot of fights regarding dual agency. Is that good? You have one person representing both. There was a time not that many years ago where every agent who represented buyer was a sub-agent of one who represented the seller. I think the industry and really the general public, maybe that ain't so good because I'm coming as a buyer and I don't have actual representation. We have in this group here individuals who provide access to understanding how somebody who might be first generation, nobody in the family, there's not a brother or sister or mom and dad or an uncle say this is how it works, to kind of give access to it. But we're moving into a space where there's some risk that buyers may no longer have representation because they are unable to afford to pay for representation. And so I'm curious as to your thoughts of what role does a buyer's real estate agent, ideally realtor, but just a representation kind of in the process?
Actually, I'd like to kind of push back.
Sure.
As a housing counseling agency, I see too many clients after they're in escrow because they need the 8-hour certificate to qualify for a down payment. They come in,
Right.
and that's when they learn of all the different down payment resources that are available, but it's a little bit too late for them, and they say, I wish I had come here first. So for me, I really think that resources that are invested in housing counseling agencies to help people to even dream that actually they could buy a home without 20%. There might be programs that are 0%. So there's all these special purpose credit programs that are rolling out that really make some of the impossible possible. But unfortunately, again, I see a trend where a lot of the big banks are rolling out, unless we're there to intervene to raise these kind of data points to say that the API community also needs to be included, that they keep on leaving out the API community. So I do want to put that out there. But it will, if there are more housing counseling agencies that share the good news, and even realtors and lenders, loan officers are informed and equipped. Bank of America, a shout out to them. They were probably the first to equip all their loan officers on their special purpose credit program. Usually it's just 1 or 2 loan officers per region. So really, the average person could not even benefit from any of these programs. So I really want to push back to say that, again, there should be a greater thrust for resources for housing counseling and all the other stuff, including affordable housing. And I run a faith organization that have land, right, that could be utilized to build affordable housing. They just don't get the outreach or understanding.
I think the part that I'm to kind of have a conversation about is there's the assumption that the resources are here and what we all do is to provide the resource. But in the end, when a home is actually purchased, when you buy from a new development, you go to the developer, they have their in-house sales staff. But if somebody's buying a resale, is there a value that after they understand that when you actually negotiate to buy the property, that they have representation, or should they just go directly to the sellers? I have a program, let's do a deal. I'm just curious. So Brian?
Yeah, so I mean, all studies show that Asian Americans, like other people of color, are incredibly cost burdened already. And so everyone's saving, every dime they can in order to buy a house. And so, and then as Angie's pointed out, and all the data shows, Asian Americans are more likely to be in higher cost areas as well. So the expectation now that on top of that, if they want an agent, that it should come out of their own pocket, I think would be disastrous and would go the reverse direction as we're trying to close homeownership gaps. And then the notion that they should be their own agent and go up against, say, a seller's agent, I also think makes little sense. As I mentioned, Asian Americans, more than any other group, find real estate agents helpful. And that's also partly because Asian Americans disproportionately are first-time home buyers. And so the notion that if you are the first, say, and you might be first generation home buyers in this country, the notion that you're going to now just jump into this process and represent yourself, I think is unrealistic. So I think all of that is key, not to mention the fact that also if you're a first-time home buyer or first-generation home buyer, you do not have resources from the sale, say, of another home. And that's one of the things that we see loud and clear in the data, that Asian Americans are seeking higher education in order to afford a home because there's less family wealth to draw on. And so all of those factors suggest to me that we should be doing everything we can to lower the costs to enter home ownership and not presume that one model fits all for all groups.
Yeah, now I'll give a little context to this. And there has been a push, and in fact it was litigation that was successful because the way most buyers' agents are compensated is that a person who sells a property and contracts with a real estate agent to sell the property agrees to share some of that fee with the person who brings in the buyer. That is under attack. And there are now statements that buyer representation should only be for people who can afford it. You know, other people, they just go to internet and buy it. The challenge is, I think, that when you're talking about somebody who's new to the system, the counseling agents are critical, absolutely critical. And real estate agents who work closely with counseling agents really understand that process. My belief, in my end, we should push for more of our members to understand these resources to help underserved communities. But I think the challenge is if this structure where that fee from somebody who's selling, hopefully with a profit, has some money, is not there, it may change the dynamics. It may actually be a barrier as bad as redlining. So now we are technically out of time. I was supposed to allow a few questions. If anybody, maybe I would take one or two questions if you're okay with going over a few minutes. Or if we've answered everybody's questions too, thank you so much for being here. And let's give this group a round of applause.